Hello everyone, welcome to SAW Dialogues 2022, presented by Art and Market in partnership with National Arts Council Singapore as part of the 10th edition of Singapore Art Week. We're glad to have you with us on this live stream. My name is Jean Hare and I am the Assistant Director of Programs at the National Gallery Singapore and lead programmer of the Light Tonight Festival, a marquee event at Singapore Art Week. Before I introduce our speaker and topic for today's session, I'd like to share on how you can participate during the session and submit your questions to the speakers. So on the screen right now is a QR code that you can scan with your mobile camera function to access Slido for the Q&A segment. Now, at any point in time, you can also access Slido through the URL at slido.com, that's SLIDO.com, with the code SAW2022, and that's SAW2022. Now, feel free to type in a question at any point in time. We will get to as many questions as possible at the end of the talk. Now, you will also have the option of turning on the automatic live caption function by clicking on the CC button on your video player. Now, without further ado, I'm honored to introduce the talk for today titled Speculations on the Virtual, co-presented by the National Gallery Singapore. The session is moderated by Daniel Birnbaum, Artistic Director of Acute Art. Daniel is also the curator of Visions, an outdoor augmented reality art exhibition at the Light Tonight Festival, presented at the National Gallery Singapore. Today, he is joined by visual artist Ho Tzu Nyen and Professor Mi Yu. Our program will begin with an introduction by Daniel, followed by a presentation by Tzu Nyen, and finally, a moderated session between the speakers. It is now my pleasure to hand the time over to Daniel to introduce the speakers. Over to you, Daniel.
So good morning, I say, because I'm in London, and good afternoon, I guess, is more appropriate. Yes, this conversation is part of a collaboration between the National Gallery Singapore and the initiative Acute Art in London. I work as the artistic director of this studio or laboratory for art and technology. This conversation will be about the exhibition that we open today. We have Ho Tzu Nyen, an acclaimed Singapore-based artist, curator, theatre director, whose practice spans films, installations, and theatrical performances that often begin as engagements with historical and philosophical texts and artifacts. He represented Singapore at the 54th Venice Biennale in 2011 with his video installation, The Cloud of Unknowing. In recent years, Ho has embarked on moving image installations incorporating VR based on his research on Kyoto School philosophers, a group of philosophers in Japan. And starting with Hotel Aporia, 2019, and continuing actually until this day, because Tzu has produced a new piece, no longer VR, but AR, that is part of this exhibition, Visions. In the conversation, we will also have Mi Yu, a professor of art and economics at the University of Kassel. Dr. Yu is trained in media theory and science and technology studies. Her academic interests are in new and historical materialism, performance philosophy, as well as the history of political theory and the philosophy of Eurasia. She's one of the curators of the 13th Shanghai Biennial, 2020 to 21. But before these wonderful people join us, I will give a little introduction into this exhibition and into the world of augmented reality. So on a personal note, perhaps, I mean, I'm a curator of very traditional exhibitions and institutions originally. I've been working for art schools and museums in Europe and for biennials. In many years ago, I curated the Venice Biennale. So this whole world of art and technology is not new to me, but it's a recent experiment. It's now 3 years ago that I kind of left the traditional museum world. Not quite true. I'm still involved with museums, of course, and I'm very, very happy that we have this collaboration with the National Gallery Singapore. But I started to work directly with artists exploring new mediums. And I think that you know, in a century, it seems that once or twice something entirely new appears, and everything changes. What do I mean with that? Well, think of the introduction of photography in the 19th century, how it actually changed art and you know, the possibilities for art reaching an audience, and it even changed what art can be, basically. Cinema. Later on in the 20th century, we had the new mediums, the video camera, television, the internet. I guess that in our century, we have a cluster of new mediums, digital mediums that are, you know, confusing to many of us. And there is, you know, there are new possibilities with virtual reality, with augmented reality, mixed reality. And the Acute Art project started with a number of VR productions, and we did a few virtual reality works with Marina Abramovic and Jeff Koons and Anish Kapoor and Olafur Eliasson, and pretty well-known artists who are not necessarily digital natives. But the idea was to see what happens if important artists get access to tools that they maybe normally would not have had. For me, this was a little bit of a continuation of something I was very interested in more historically, a movement called Experiments in Art and Technology. And that was a very lively movement in the 1960s that involved some of the most important artists of that moment in the US. So John Cage and Andy Warhol and Merce Cunningham and many others were exploring new technologies thanks to this initiative EAT. And many years ago, I worked for a museum in Sweden, the Moderna Museet, that was you know, one of the leading museums back then in Europe, and they owned many of these EAT works. So I started to wonder, what would EAT be today? EAT is actually 60 years ago, and experiments in art and technology, of course, continue. So in a way, Acute Art in London is an attempt to see what would that conversation about with leading artists and totally new mediums be today. So virtual reality is, of course, a very overwhelming medium. It can be sensational. But then came the pandemic 2 years ago, and we could not show any of these works. So we started to explore AR instead, augmented reality, things that you see through your telephone or through an iPad, and that we could place in, you know, outside rather than in museums, because all the galleries and museums and art fairs seemed to be closed. So in the middle of the lockdown, we staged a little exhibition in London, and this is in a way the beginning of what we're talking about today, because it was the first augmented reality group show, and it had no institutional support or no sponsorship. It was a totally no budget version of an electronic group show in the public sphere. And some of the pieces that we are you know, showing in Singapore now were presented here, but in a very kind of low, you know, in a kind of more humble setting, perhaps. And I thought maybe we could just look at a few minutes of this little clip. It's you know, a film that we produced when we had placed the works along the river in London. We call this exhibition Unreal City, and that's a quote from T.S. Eliot, the British poet. His most famous poem is called The Wasteland, and there's this line, Unreal City, that recurs over and over again. So maybe we just look at a few minutes, because it could be interesting to see some of the artists talking about this new medium.
Outside. Why not look at art? And why not try to scale the art so it fits with the city? It's a specialty, and there's these boys, and every time you see one of them, there is a work of art there through the Acute app.
My name is Kujong Ah. The work is called Density.
I'm interested in the idea of a narrative that moves along with its time. The octopus and the light bulb man, they were basically sculptures in bronze. I was surprised myself how these old characters translated so well into a complete new medium, taking them into a virtual world, immaterialized them in a way.
I've always made work that deals with technology, this idea of the dislocation and the intimacy you can get. You interact with your phone probably more than anything in your life. So to have something appear in your field of vision, it's very powerful psychologically. It's connected to your central nervous system. The image attaches itself to your sense of equilibrium.
Maybe this is actually enough. It's just to give us a glimpse of a different context where we showed some of the works. Here you see Thomas Saraceno's Spider. So some of the works we reintroduce as part of this exhibition. But of course, you know, augmented reality is a very interesting medium because we can work with scale and we can work with the constellations. So I think the Singapore version will be an entirely new and very different experience. It's also the first time that we are working with a major national institution. So I'm very, very happy about this possibility to stage a more official version of this very experimental thing we did alone, basically, in London. So what's the difference between virtual reality and augmented reality? I think some of you know all of this, know everything about this, but still, you know, things you see in the headset, of course, is much more visually overwhelming. But you're alone and you need a lot of technology and you need to do this in an institution. And we've done a few things in galleries and art fairs and so on. And AR is somehow much more, in a way, I feel liberating because you can work with institutions and with cities, but you can also actually be, totally independent. It's a little bit like in Germany, there's this famous show that happens every 10 years in a city called Münster, where they put sculptural works in the city. And it's been something that, a friend of mine, a very important colleague, curator called Kaspar Koenig, invented almost half a century ago. And it's art in the public sphere. And I guess AR is a perfect tool for art in the public sphere. It's a strange intervention tool, and one can create juxtapositions and strange dialogues with the city, with monuments, with buildings. And I guess the backdrop in Singapore is very symbolic for people who know a lot about Singapore and recognize this. And I think it's very interesting that we are, that we have this place to work with, the civic district, the historical, very important place. So we are presenting works by some of the artists that you saw in this little clip: Olafur Eliasson, Kos, Chao Fei, Marco Brambilla, Alicia Kvade, Thomas Saraceno. They all have different reasons why they are interested in this medium, I think. And very soon we will hear a little bit from Tzu what it is that he finds interesting with this medium, because I guess some of them are sculptors, others are more, performance artists or even painters. And it's interesting how some of the themes that people have explored in more traditional mediums maybe can be translated into AR. And there is something a little bit ghost-like or spectral or even, magical with the medium, of course. You go there, there's nothing. I mean, if you just walk by the National Gallery, you will see nothing. One has to know how these things appear. and the technology is still by no means perfect. I'm fully aware that we're early when it comes to exploring these possibilities. But so I mean, I think it's quite brave by the National Gallery to do an experimental thing like this, because one could, wait 5 years and it will be more slick and frictionless. And we're still, exploring this. Very few other initiatives exist like this. We are not the only ones that produce augmented reality, of course, but I think we're almost alone in working with very, very, important artists who are not necessarily at home in these mediums. I would like to say a few words about Tzu, who I find, who's a deeply fascinating artist for me, someone I have followed for many years. I saw when I've been working, as I said, for the Venice Biennale in many capacities. So I have, encountered Tzu's work in that context. And a few years ago, Tzu came to Stockholm, where I then worked to give a presentation. So I'm very grateful that this is, we have a chance to work together. And Tzu is a very special artist in the sense that he has this philosophical interest and, philosophical knowledge. I have a background in philosophy myself, so I'm by no means, an expert or anything in Asian traditions, but I did hear about the Kyoto School many years ago because I was interested in Western traditions, phenomenology with thinkers like Husserl and Heidegger. And I know the Kyoto School was a philosophical school that somehow mixed Western methods, so to say, with the Japanese traditions. And I'm very fascinated with this piece. It's a kind of collage-like mix of voices, and it brings up themes such as political themes and philosophical themes, and issues such as nationalism, and it's a kind of dialogue between philosophers and quite an ambitious AR project. So I'm very, very grateful that we have been able to do this with Tzu, and I am more than excited that we can now present it in such a prestigious context. So maybe, Tzu, I leave the word to you now for a little bit to talk about your piece.
Thank you, Daniel, for the introduction. And very happy to be part of the adventure as well. So I think for today, I would just like to give a little bit of context surrounding this work that I'm presenting with Acute at the festival. So the title of the piece is called Language. And as Daniel has already mentioned, it's connected to my ongoing interest and also a series of projects that I've been developing about the Kyoto School. So just to start, I thought I would just kind of share with everyone a kind of quick map of some of the main actors in the Kyoto School. So the Kyoto School is a term that is used informally to describe a group of philosophers who built, I think they circle around a key figure by the name of Kitaro Nishida. So I think, Kitaro Nishida, especially in the earlier part of the 20th century, he was regarded by, many Japanese as the most important modern Japanese philosopher. But I think that after the Second World War, their reputation suffered. And I will get into that a little bit. So today, if you visit Kyoto in Japan, if you look at the tourist maps, there is usually a philosopher's path. And that path was actually Nishida's path, daily path from his home to his place of teaching at the Kyoto University. So, Nishida was in many ways kind of considered the founder of the Kyoto School. And around him was a group of students and associates all of them affiliated with the Kyoto University. And this is the circle that we commonly refer to as the Kyoto School. All of the individuals that orbits around Nishida are very different. They are very diverse. Nothing really specifically connects them, possibly with the exception that some of Nishida's key philosophical concepts can be found in a lot of their work. And it's too complex to explain very deeply Nishida's philosophy today. But let me just say that, as Daniel has already mentioned, one of Nishida's key interests was sort of encountering Western with Eastern philosophy. In a strange sense, we can almost say that he was trying to overcome the limits of Western philosophy with Eastern resources. And this is kind of like at the same time that, Japan perhaps was trying to overcome the West in military terms. So this parallel is kind of what interests me with the Kyoto School. So in my work, language through the phone, the work is seen totally through a mobile phone. When you first turn on the work, so this is just a screenshot of what it looks like through the phone. When you first turn on the work, you will not see any particular figures. You will not see anything. What you will hear solely is a voice, and it's a voice articulating a text by Nishida Kitaro. And sort of one of the key foundations of Nishida's philosophy, I would say, is the idea of zettai mu, which in Japanese means absolute nothingness. So it's almost like the foundation of Nishida's concept is this notion of absolute nothingness, which is very much drawn from his interest in Buddhism, especially Zen Buddhism, which he took very seriously. So in language, we use the text of three philosophers. So Nishida was the first of them. And the second philosopher whose text we used is that of Hajime Tanabe. Tanabe is very often regarded as the second most important figure of the Kyoto School. He was also Nishida's successor. He took over the university position of Nishida when Nishida retired as the chair of the philosophy department. He's also the first eldest kind of like disciple of Nishida. I just also wanted to mention that, Nishida himself died actually in 1945. So when the war actually broke out, Nishida was not so active, but the rest of his students were caught kind of like in the middle of it. So about Hajime Tanabe, the specific text that I've chosen from Hajime Tanabe is a text which is called Death, Life, and it was presented at the Kyoto Imperial University in 1943. So what is interesting about Tanabe is that from, I think, 1942 onwards, when the war broke out, he stopped writing philosophy, and he only delivered many texts, many lectures at universities to students and also to high school students. So this particular, just to give you a sense of the timeline, like in 1943, May 1943, when he delivered Death, Life, in about a few months' time, conscription of Japanese students would intensify. And very soon, Japan would kind of enter into their last phase of the battle, where students, for example, were conscripted to be kamikaze pilots. So it was in this kind of like mood and context where Hajime Tanabe delivered this specific lecture called Death, Life. And if I were to sum up Death, Life, I would say that it's essentially a kind of an argument to the students that to die for the nation state at that specific moment is a way in which man can be sort of reconciled with the absolute, where man kind of like, get in touch with the absolute is by dying for the state. So I find this a rather horrific lecture. And back to the work language. So if you see nothing on the phone, you will hear Nishida. But if we start to move the phone upwards into the sky, what we will see is this robot, and done in a Japanese anime style. So the proper term that someone really interested in anime would use to call this is a mecha, like mechanic. So a mecha is the term we use to describe this kind of robots. And for those of you who have some knowledge of Japanese anime, you might find the design of this mecha somewhat familiar. It's actually from the classic Japanese anime called Gundam, and this is kind of like the bad guy in the series. So this is kind of a legendary mecha. It's almost like the stormtrooper in Star Wars, but this is the mecha, like the bad guy in Gundam, the soldier, the grunts, and basically I chose this specific design because the design of this mecha, this green, this military green kind of, and this single red eye that it has on its face sort of very much reminds us of the design of the Zero fighter plane, which is what the Japanese used in the Second World War, and a lot of them were used for kamikaze attacks. So we will see this mecha in the work when we hear this text of Tanabe, basically telling the students that dying for the state is sublime, and something kind of like happens to this mecha. And the third text that I used in the work, I just want to very quickly introduce the source of the text, is by a very interesting sort of second generation Kyoto School philosopher called Miki Kiyoshi. If Hajime Tanabe was the eldest first disciple of Nishida, many people say that Miki Kiyoshi was his favorite disciple. So that's also partially the reason I decided to choose the two of them. But Miki Kiyoshi is also regarded as someone almost, I would say, ideologically opposite of Hajime Tanabe. You can see in his chronology of his life, like the birth and death date, that he died in 1945. So basically, Miki Kiyoshi is usually regarded as the left wing of the Kyoto School. He was arrested towards the end of the war for harboring communists. I think it was the second time he was arrested. So very often related to his kind of activities with connected to the leftists. And he very tragically died in prison, I think about 6 weeks after the war ended. So I think, the prisoners were not released in time, and they were just left in the prison. And he supposedly died of scabies. So I imagine it was quite a painful and harsh passing. So, back to the work language. So if you are looking at nothing, you hear Nishida. And if you look up to the sky, you will hear the text of Tanabe, and you will see the robots. And if you swing the camera in the opposite direction to the ground and to your left, you will see. So here it's still very far away, so we don't really see a very clear image, but it's of a Japanese man in prison clothes. Perhaps we can think of him as Miki Kiyoshi. And we see this while we hear also another text by Miki Kiyoshi. And also something happens to the figure as the text proceeds. So essentially, that's kind of like what makes up the work. Maybe just in ending, I thought I would very quickly just show you, share with everyone the origin of this project. This actually came out from a work that I was already working on, which was shown in Japan, called Voice of Void. So all of these characters and these figures are extracted from this work. And I thought it's relevant maybe to speak a bit about this work because it was done in virtual reality. So I guess that kind of like connects with our topic today. So the work is made up of 4 rooms. So in one room, we see a prison and a prisoner. In the second room, we see a Mecca in the sky, and we also introduced to the text of Tanabe. In the third room, we see a tea room with 4 other disciples of Nishida engaged in a roundtable discussion, and this is a historical event. And in the last room, what we have are 4 audience members wearing the virtual reality headsets. And when they wear the headsets, what they see or encounter are those scenes that we have seen earlier. So in those earlier scenes, we are looking at the scene from the outside, but when you wear the VR goggles, you go into the inside of the representation, you know. So audience literally become these characters that we see. So the audience also becomes, for example, the mecha, the robot, as it's suspended in the sky and as it kind of like disintegrates. So this is kind of like the overall world that the audience can freely move between. What you see at the bottom, this building is the prison that was holding Miki Kiyoshi. And if the audience should completely, so the audience are able to move into the sky, or to sink into the prison, or to stay in the tea room, which is in this multicolored globe, through their physical postures. So if they are sitting down, they are in the tea room. If they stand up, they will ascend into the sky and be one of these robots. If they lie down on the floor, they will enter into the prison. And finally, if the audience do not move their bodies at all, and they stay completely still, they will enter into this empty space, which slowly expands. It's almost like a kind of meditation space. It's a space of nothingness, or absolute nothingness, if you want it. So this is the last slide that I will share. And this is just showing you a Voice of Void when it was presented in, last presented in Kyoto recently. So we see all of these audience encountering the work. And, you know, interestingly, like I wasn't in Kyoto to set up the work, but what they told me was that many people felt like it was as though there was some kind of strange religious proceeding happening in this space with all these audience wearing these strange devices. Yeah, so I think I will stop now for the introduction and I'll hand it back to Daniel.
Thank you so much, Tzu. So we will bring in Miyu, of course, but maybe just a quick question about the piece. Why do you call it language? I mean, this is a silly question. I understand why it's, you know, it's a language-based piece. It's different from everything else we've done, I think. It's not a narrative piece, perhaps, not in that strong sense of, you know, telling a story, but we have done AR works before with sound, and a few of them, you know, say things, but it's a very discursive piece. And maybe, you know, actually, why is it called language?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, so I think, you know, as you already mentioned, you know, the work is built on these 3 pieces of text. So it's, and it's, for me, it's about imagining how these 3 pieces of text can relate to each other. So the work itself is almost this kind of a kind of construction of the relation between these 3 texts, between the master and his 2 disciples. So I think it has a lot to do, of course, with the discursive and language. And I decided eventually also to call it language because with works in AR and even VR, dealing with language is not exactly the most immediate thing we think about when we think of these words. So I thought just, you know, for that alone, it's interesting just to call the work language. and to
I
draw
think
our attention. Yeah,
I think it's really interesting actually, because it breaks out of some expectations, and I think one of the limitations of AR so far, if I critique a little bit the things that we have done, is that they become a little bit similar, and more different objects, and after 5 or 10 of them you kind of understand what the possibilities are, but you push it very far in a direction that no one else has done. It's also a very serious piece, a very theoretical and not entirely pleasant, if I may. It's a bit of a unpleasant experience even.
yes.
And we call this conversation speculations on the virtual. So I will ask Miyu to join us here, and she is a writer and an expert in media art, and it's the themes we can discuss go far beyond our exhibition now, and also far beyond the example of Tzu, even if this is a great example. I'm a bit interested in, I shouldn't pretend to understand the Kyoto School, but I did study philosophy in Germany. So of course I read a lot of Heidegger, because everyone had to, and trying to explain or understand these themes, like for instance, the notion of technology is a major theme in his thinking, that the metaphysical Western systems somehow lead up to some sort of final technological phase. So it's kind of interesting that you bring in these kind of Heideggerian connections. Most people would think that Heidegger is maybe a philosopher of technology, but actually, a serious, he develops a serious critique of technology, basically. So it's kind of interesting to hear these voices that have, some sort of Heideggerian echo, at least in my head, that they appear in this world of robotics and AR experimentation. And we can get to this, but Miyu, what do you think? I mean, if we say speculating on the virtual, in my brief introduction, I said that we've been through a number of paradigm shifts before, through the introduction of photography or cinema or television or the internet. And here we are with a handful of new possibilities, and they're different, but they're somehow connected, AR and VR and mixed reality. And I remember the first time I spoke about VR, I think in a more systematic way, was with a friend who's a quite famous novelist called Douglas Copeland, and he's always been interested in these things. And that was a conversation for the magazine Art Forum, and he was so into this new world somehow, fascinated. And I asked him, what kind of a revolution is this virtual turn? Is it comparable to the the introduction of television, or is it even comparable to the introduction of electricity? And Doug said electricity. So now the question is, what kind of a shift are we living through? Is this like a major revolution here with the AR and VR and things? For most of us, it's relatively new. I know that some specialists have been talking about VR at MIT or YCAM in Germany since decades, but for most artists and most people in the art world, like myself, it's something that we are aware of since a few years only. But I mean, Miyu, what do you think? Is it electricity or television? No, but beyond what kind of a transformation is this?
That's a wonderful yeah, to get into this question of, is it electricity or is it not? I like to kind of zoom out a little bit, and in the tech world, people love the idea of leapfrogging, right? So a whole country is skipping, for example, credit card and moving directly into mobile payment or something, right? So it seems that if we put art in this whole space, art seems to be always a little bit too early for something. and then at the same time a little late. So I'm also saying this with reference to the EAT and if you look at VR and AR of all of these different experiments already in the 80s and 90s, right, with these extremely unwieldy headsets. And then, of course, now what we have is a much better streamlined technology, much more accessible technology. But that also means that all the media tech companies are doing it much fancier, right? So game companies are doing much fancier versions of what artists can possibly imagine. So this is not to say that we should no longer do art in this context, but the question is, how do we do this kind of art? And how do we, I think, as Daniel, you put it earlier, how do we scale also? And in that context, looking again back at some of the broader kind of cultural, artistic, and historical movements and happenings, one thing that I want to point out is that as we kind of go through the history of different media or forms of art, there's always a kind of a larger cultural background to it, right? So one such medium we can take as a form of Gesamtkunst or total art is, of course, opera, and then we have someone like Zizek claiming that the death of opera is actually connected to the invention of psychoanalysis, right? So it's almost as if that this deconstructivist tendency to explain it all from psychoanalysis kind of purged all this inexplicable desires, all this cathartic madness out of the experience of opera, right? So yeah, I think what I'm interested in is what is the, and of course we don't even need to take opera as a reference point. We can take, for example, from more Asian traditions, collective rituals or shamanic rituals and all that. So, but I guess my interest is what is the cultural philosophical condition that kind of maybe renders a certain artistic medium, artistic expression obsolete, or at the same time also heralds in something new, right? So what do you feel? Before we even get into the question about this, the media specific questions, what is sort of the general cultural philosophical condition of our time?
I mean, here I am in London in a very boring little kitchen, being presented as a curator of an exhibition on another continent in Singapore. And, you know, yes, I am the curator in the sense that, you know, I selected the artist, invited Sue, we produced that piece, we've invented a title, a context, and we have a great partner. So, you know, Jean and the friends at the National Gallery have installed this. So of course it's very far away from what curation normally has meant in my life, where I, you know, stand in a gallery and install painting shows and so on. But you know, our general condition, we all know that we've been, you know, at least most of us have been locked into apartments, and you know, in London we were not even allowed to leave the apartment. And it's kind of interesting how the pandemic has somehow speeded up the interest in these things. So my answer to your question is now very, very specific, that, you know, we have lived through a very strange period. And when I started to be interested in VR and AR, I did think that it would come, but of course it came much, much quicker because of this strange situation. And then one can of course ask, is this pandemic a little bit like some sort of test, or like a, you know, someone said, a dress rehearsal for bigger transformations, you know, where I noticed that maybe not Slavoj Žižek, but although he always talks about everything, but you know, I think it was Noam Chomsky and Bruno Latour who both said that this is the dress rehearsal for, you know, adjusting to the climate crisis. And even politicians like Angela Merkel have said that this is, you know, we should use this as a kind of moment of So I guess one doesn't have to be a deep philosopher or Michel Foucault to understand that if we, introduce new visual mediums that are quite strong, you lock every person in the world into their apartment, And on top of that, you know, you introduce some sort of a new currency idea of, you know, cryptocurrencies and all of that. We're not speaking about that. It's a different theme maybe, but of course, everything changes somehow. Yeah, so I mean, I think your question was maybe had another direction, but I think, you know, through coincidences, all of this has happened very quickly. And you know, a few years ago, I don't think that we would have done AR shows on the other side of the continent, but somehow the normal art world, if it ever returns entirely, will maybe use these possibilities. And yeah, I mean, this was maybe not a good answer, but the general atmosphere and climate and context within which this happens, it all came together in some sort of perfect storm, so that suddenly these possibilities are, you know, get more attention. And then we have the whole conversation. I mean, I'm actually involved with another project that will launch in a few days, actually, which is what you mentioned, that, you know, the big gaming companies and all of, you know, are developing things like this. And we are presenting an entire exhibition in the metaverse. It's going to be, you know, further away from the art world because it's not with the National Gallery of Singapore, or, you know, but, you know, the whole conversation about the metaverse that I'm sure you, Miu, have followed for a long time, since you're an expert in these things. But for most people, you know, I think it was the moment that Facebook suddenly renamed itself and called Meta that everybody tried to figure out, what is the metaverse all about? What is that? And people would, you know, maybe know that there's a novel called Snow Crash, and that's where it, you know, what the idea was, or the name was coined. But there are many things that make our moment quite interesting. I wouldn't be able to say where we're going. I'm trying to figure this out with you and with the artists and all of this, but it seems that we are living in interesting times.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I guess another dimension to that, and it's also connected to your comment, Daniel, this whole dimension of the bodily and of some kind of collective experience, right? And also solidarity. And maybe we can even go as far as to claim that technology ultimately is something that comes out of a collective will. And, you know, there are numerous philosophers, theories that push technology back to a more collective experience of, say, magic, or cosmologies or experiences of that, right? And, you know, so an example would be a certain cosmology that understands the place of the human in the universe in a particular construct, and then the tools or technologies such as astrology, right, would be devised to kind of prove that, and to also construct sort of a more social structures around it. So I'm really interested in the cosmological dimensions of technology, and I think in what Zi you just presented, there's also some sense of an acceleration of that, because in a sense, this cosmology of the Kyoto School is this absolute nothingness, and for that, and in order to get there, war became a means for them, right? I mean, to put it really blatantly, I mean, I know there are a lot of nuances to that. So that's sort of one side of the dialectics, which is how do we go from cosmologies to technologies? And then what we witness these days, I think increasingly, is the other side, which is how technologies come to define their own cosmologies. So example would be Elon Musk, who claims that the whole world is a matrix-like simulation, right? So everything is a simulation, everything is computation, the whole world is just all VR. And starting from there, you have any number of Silicon Valley people trying to hack consciousness and to build a whole kind of technological / consciousness experiments around that. Now, I'm not judging that as right or wrong or good or bad, but just to observe it in terms of what is sort of, yeah, what is the dominant and universalizing image of the world? And it seems that now we increasingly start from the point of technology rather than from the position of cosmologies. And that can be maybe a dimension that we can think with when we think about our engagements with technology today.
Yeah, I mean, so this somehow is a question for you, because I think you actually did produce a piece that somehow links what can possibly be a little bit dry, exploring a new or relatively new medium with something which is not dry at all, namely a whole philosophical school that actually tries to understand the world, basically, you know. So you have certainly gone beyond the kind of gimmick. I mean, there is something gimmicky about some AR works, that they're just like small things you can play around with, but you have filled it with your work with the, you know, it's a visionary piece. It's a piece about grand stories and designs and ambitions to understand, you know, the cosmos, basically. So I mean, one question before I mean, I'll ask you to explore this difficult theme, but you know, is simply, what is the role of art in this, you know, more and more technical universe that we inhabit? That, you know, it's going very quickly, that we all have telephones, and they're so powerful, and they would have, you know, a few decades ago, they would have been like magic, unbelievable, that, you know, you have a little flat object in your pocket through which you can, you know, have FaceTime calls with all your friends at the same time, even if they're on the other side of the planet. It is something unbelievable, actually, that we have, you know, that we're getting used to so quickly. And of course the question can be, is art there to celebrate these new virtual possibilities, or to create friction and you know, protest almost, or critique, or you know, the technological universe is also, you know, as we know, not unproblematic. It's also, you know, a tool for control and power and extraction of you know, financial resources and data, and you know, there's something to fight also, and something to be a bit worried about, even if it's visually fun and one can do good things and interesting things. I mean, for me, it's always been that when people say, how can you work with this? You're so dependent on the big tech companies and so on. Yes, we are, but so is everyone else sending a little message, you know, that why, if not thinkers like you, me, you, or other writers and artists are exploring these, and we leave it only to the technologists, I think there's something wrong. Yes, if we gave up before we even started to engage with these tools. But and I'm digressing, I realize. Sue, what do you think about the cosmological aspect of this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So again, I think there are multiple ways to engage with that question. So, you know, maybe just starting from some of my earlier intentions in, you know, investigating the Kyoto School, and sort of deliberately doing that through this so-called, you know, new medium. So for me, actually, it is the combination that is interesting. You know, there's you know, there are moments when, you know, if we think about some of these newer mediums, the immediate kind of contents that we might associate with this new medium might be kind of contemporary problems dealing with data mining, surveillance, etc. So I thought, as a start, it's interesting to use this technology, but kind of splice them with historical issues, you know. So issues that we think are almost past, or you know, from a different historical era. So I think the first move for me is to kind of make this type of almost like a montage to begin. But after putting these two things together, you know, the montage creates a certain interesting new associations. So one that I might speak a little bit about, for example, is the idea that I mentioned briefly when I introduced Nishida Kitaro, which is his idea that, almost for him, his ontology or his ontological system, is built on this idea of nothingness. So sort of the ground of, his philosophical system is this, what he calls absolute nothingness. And he, towards the middle part of his career, he started thinking about a term which was very important for him, called place of absolute nothingness. So topos of absolute nothingness. So he says that this absolute nothingness is the only thing that is inherent in everything that exists. So everything that exists in a way can only be defined because it partakes of this absolute nothingness. So just in a very a simple way, to begin, transferring this notion of the place of absolute nothingness into, let's say, a VR world, already creates some kind of sparks, right? Like in VR, when you are wearing the goggles, you can see an entire world, which at the same time doesn't sort of physically exist, So this contrast between nothing and everything that VR allows was something that attracted me. And I would say, kind of pinpointing back to this current project, which is AR on the phone, I find that what is most interesting for me looking at this work through the phone is that it's very clear that it's simultaneously something that you see in the phone and simultaneously nothing, because you can see outside, the frame of your phone, that in the scene, in the real space, there is no object. So this is for me actually what characterized the whole entire experience of AR, which is that you see something existing and simultaneously not existing at the same time. So it's still this cut. I would say it's almost like this cut between what exists and what doesn't exist, through the phone. This tension, which I think is what makes AR the most interesting and fascinating for me. So just to also tie back a little bit to what Miu mentioned earlier, I think she mentioned the word like bodily. And I know that, Daniel, philosophically, your sort of like area of specialty was kind of like phenomenology, like if I remember correctly, which of course has a lot to do with the bodily. And it's very interesting to think about the bodily together with VR. Sometimes when we think about VR, the immediate notion we have is that it's a world that completely doesn't exist, or it's, virtual and it's light, or it's almost weightless. But at the same time, I think, having experienced VR works and working in VR, I find it actually an intensely bodily experience, right? I mean, from wearing the headsets, which is the interface, a feeling that, to this kind of strange perception of motion that you have in VR or AR, that strange sensations when you pass through a wall or when you are ascending, So I think it's, for me, the roots of these technologies is still very much actually our body, and its experience is born out of almost this contrast between the bodily and the virtual, So that's kind of how I see it. But maybe the final thing I just want to also mention, just to also kind of bring it back to what both you and me were discussing, was that I found it interesting that when Miu's example of speaking about psychoanalysis and opera, and Daniel, you instead of bringing up something like a school of thoughts, right? Like psychoanalysis, you brought up the pandemic, and in relation to the climate, And I find this interesting because the pandemic is, and how we are experiencing it now, it's something environmental, it's something political, is also something intensely technological, because we access news and information and we meet each other through technology, And it's also a philosophical, because thinking about the environment now, we question a lot of the basis of our so-called like humanities, and schools of thought have to be revised. So it's actually something that it's no longer just a cultural moment. It's something that is technological, political, cultural, philosophical at the same time. So I think dealing with like these kind of new technologies sort of plugs us into this world where all these different things are connected.
And there are a few questions coming in, and I think that maybe I should, respond, or we should respond to them, because this is a possibility to kind of open up the conversation a little bit. So there's a question from an anonymous, I don't know who put this question, but who said, what do you think are challenges to preserving, making and showing new forms of artworks, which rely so heavily on technology that are so quickly obsolete? Very good question, I think. I remember 20 years ago, I was invited to install, or rather to select works and then install them at MIT. MIT has a gallery called List, and the whole idea was to select a number of works from a very famous video collection, an American video collection called the Cramlish Collection, and I could pick whatever piece I wanted, but it turned out that it was rather difficult to show some of these works because they were old, and they had used devices that were no longer there. And although I had maybe the most powerful technical university, as a backer, it turned out to be almost impossible. And this is not yet AR, VR, mixed reality, and all of the things we're talking about now. It's just, time-based media, video and such things. So of course, the question is very relevant. Things grow old very quickly. And it's nothing special about that for our medium, but of course, it's a very technical world. And I have to admit that some of the works that we did 3-4 years ago maybe already look a little bit dated, which doesn't necessarily make them look bad. I think sometimes, a piece that belongs to a certain era isn't uninteresting because it belongs to that era. I mean, an early Bruce Nauman piece on a little monitor looks fantastic, but you can see that it's from 1971 and that it's not produced yesterday. And the same will probably be true with these works. And your piece too will probably look a bit old in a few years. But what are your reactions to this question? We're working with technologies we're working with art that is totally dependent on technology, and these technologies are changing so quickly that there will be challenges. I mean, maybe even to show the works at some point, who knows? And I'm sure, Miyu, that you've come across these questions before, not necessarily only relating to mixed or AR, but like art and technology. What are the challenges here, curatorially, from a museum perspective? One thing is that things grow old. Yes, they do, but that happens if you're a painter also. But what are the institutional and curatorial challenges here? I mean, what do you think, Tzu? Your VR piece is already a few years old. It will be, dated, maybe in a good way, but you will feel that it's, in 5 years, these technologies will have been transformed again, and one will feel that it's from, when was it made? In 19 or something?
Yeah. 19, and I had a few different VR works, but for me, I'm completely fine with things looking their age, So in fact, I think it's often how one wears one age, or how you sort of manifest the times that is really interesting, instead of artwork that kind of like pretends that it's like from the future, So I think, like you said, Bruce Nauman, I mean, really a prime, example of something that sort of is so powerful because it seems to encapsulate like its moment so profoundly. But I would also say that maybe our moment is a little bit different from that earlier moment of the media art, where a lot of the mediums that were still kind of like physical, in a sense that like, your different formats of tapes, from VHS to like, you have all these different kind of like formats, which made it very complicated for us to re-show this work. But I think we seem to be at a moment where it's much more, the work that we are producing now is data, which at least for now seems much easier to kind of like update or to keep alive, just, because of their form. So I think these questions are also changing, and it differs from case to case, I would say.
Yeah, I think you guys have already covered a lot of ground, and I absolutely agree with all the points raised. And I guess behind this whole question of conservation is also a broader question, a more cultural philosophical question of how do we deal with memory? How do we archive experiences, right? So a lot of some forms of art are born not to be actually archived, such as live art, right? I mean, you can record it, but you cannot possibly document that experience of it. And the same is true even in, I guess, online games today, right? You can record the game sessions, but you cannot kind of reproduce the thrills as you play the game. So deep down is something that's that's much more about what do we want, where do we want to go as a human being, as a and as a collective of human beings. And the point about data that Tzu Nyen you just raised, I also find very important, because with metaverse and with blockchain and all of that, really usher in this whole renewed kind of craze about documenting everything. But what are we actually documenting? We're just documenting transactional data, and these are like or in the world of NFT is rather the index to things than the things themselves, right? So again, as a collectivity, we have somehow moved from engaging with the things themselves to just remembering the pathways and the index to things, and then learning how to navigate with that. And what does that all mean cultural, philosophically for us? I think there's always a question that we need to ask ourselves.
There's another question that came in that is specific, but also very general. It's from someone called Joe Vickers, who quotes, this is a well-known quote, "There is no art that is not first presented to the world as technology." And the question is to you two. Joe asks, "I'm wondering if you think of your art as a kind of technology as well?"
Yeah.
Is the technology a medium, or is it actually, is your work technology? I'm trying to understand the question, but
I think that maybe the question is precisely interesting because it allows this bit of a slippage for us to also think about that. Yeah, I would say it's hard to. I would not say immediately. I would not privilege like technology as like the center of the work, but rather for me, it's part of a constellation of things that interest me. And for me, art, my art practice is this entire constellation, of which technology is only one part of. But the other way that I could think about answering the question is also just to think about, maybe the etymologically, the root word of technology, which is techne. I think in Greek, correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel, here, but I think it means to make, right? Techne, or to weave even, I think. So, it's interesting that maybe at the beginning of technology, at the origin of this word, it simply means to make. And that applies, I think, both for artists or, a technologist or a technician. It's just to make, So maybe it's also not that separated. That's another way to kind of like, for me to think about the question.
Mm. Yeah. One of the artists in our show Visions is an artist who is very interested in ecological themes. I would say two are incredibly involved in these conversations, and that's Olafur Eliasson and Thomas Saraceno. And Thomas has created these spiders, and for him it's very important to remind everyone that the virtual sphere is not some cloud up there that is not linked to our world. Actually, the cloud is a hardwired connection of servers, and that it consumes enormous amounts of energy. So he has invented this little thing on our app that you get access to more spiders if you find pictures of real spiders and you send the photo of the spider to the app. So it's just like a little reminder that the virtual world is, one, not innocent, two, not detached from our world. It's all linked, and the ecological disaster is also real, and this is not an easy way out to just say we go virtual. And a thinker that has, I think, developed many of these themes, and who I know is a friend of Tzu's, is Yukui, the Chinese thinker, who is a little bit like the Kyoto School people, someone linking the Western traditions that I'm at least fairly familiar with things I know nothing about, like this book he wrote about the technology in China, and very interesting. He's very keen to kind of link ecology and technology, talking about biodiversity and what does he say? No, technodiversity, sorry. And he has invented a whole vocabulary around these things. So I think it's a very rich world. I think that we should ask maybe Jean to return, and we should maybe remind everyone a little bit of the reason for this conversation, that there's a very large AR show with 10 artists, a collaboration with the National Gallery Singapore. There's nothing there. If you go there, you will see nothing, unless you know what to do, and you have to download this app called Acute Art, and through the prism of this app, a whole world appears. And it's a site-specific show if you want, which is a bit strange. The digital world is nowhere and everywhere, but you can geolocate, or you can locate through different technologies the works. And this is a show that only happens in Singapore, so one actually has to go there. We have explored other possibilities. Some of the works or other works are on the app, and you can place them in your kitchen or in your garden and next to your dog or your family or whatever. That's another AR possibility. But this show is a curated exhibition at the gallery, and I want to thank everyone. Thank you so much, Miyu, for joining us in this conversation. And again, Tzu, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to work with you, and I'm so happy we managed to pull this off. And again, thanks to the National Gallery that proposed that we should produce a new work, and this is exactly what I was hoping for. So, Eugene, thank you to you and the entire team. I'm so happy that we can open this. So, I say thanks. This conversation could continue for hours, I'm sure, or days, but we need another conference soon. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you very much to Daniel, Zunyan, and Miyu for this invigorating conversation. And also thank you to all attendees for spending your time with us today. And also thank you to Daniel for the shout out. So if any of our participants are keen to catch Zunyan's new AR work titled Language, please do come down to the National Gallery Singapore to catch Visions, the outdoor AR exhibition that happens from today all the way to 31st March 2022. For more details, you can go to lighttonight.sg to find out a bit more. It's been a wonderful time today, and if you would like to find out a bit more about all the talks that are happening in SAW Dialogues 2022, you can scan the QR code on the screen right now. All the recordings of the past panels will also be available for viewing on SAW Digital. Now, to also look up for the summaries of each panel that will be released on artandmarket.net, where we will share key takeaways from each talk from the SAW Dialogues. Now, of course, before you go, to help us complete this survey so that we can improve the program for the next Singapore Art Week, the link can also be found embedded in the menu of the Slido browser. So before we end, SAW Dialogues 2022 is presented by Art and Market in partnership with National Arts Council Singapore, and National Gallery Singapore is happy to be a co-presenter for today's panel. Thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you at the next talk. See you then.